The sun had barely climbed above the tree line when the workers arrived, their boots sinking slightly into the damp Louisiana soil. It was 1850, and the land breathed heavily in the early morning, thick air clinging to skin, the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves hanging low. Cicadas droned endlessly, as if warning anyone who listened that this day would not pass quietly. For these men, it was meant to be just another shift. Another stretch of land to clear. Another day paid in coins that never felt like enough. They worked in silence, as they often did. Words felt useless beneath the heat, and silence was safer. Shovels cut into the ground in steady rhythm, metal scraping against soil, dirt piling beside their boots. Sweat darkened their shirts almost immediately. The land resisted them, not violently but stubbornly, roots tangled beneath the surface, clay gripping the blades like it didn't want to let go. Then came the sound that didn't belong. A shovel struck something solid, but not stone, not wood. The impact echoed in a strange, hollow way, soft, yet unmistakably wrong. The worker paused, his grip tightening as a chill crept across his back despite the heat. He lifted the shovel and struck again. The same sound answered him, dull and empty, as though the earth itself had answered back. He knelt and brushed the soil aside with his bare hands. What emerged was pale. Too pale. Smooth where dirt should have stained it dark. A curved surface appeared first, then more of it, until the shape became impossible to mistake. A human skull stared upward, its empty eye sockets filled with packed soil, its jaw slightly open, frozen in a silent scream or prayer. For a moment, no one moved. Even the insects seemed to quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. One man stepped back so fast he nearly fell. Another crossed himself, whispering words he hadn't spoken since childhood. Someone muttered that this was no accident, that graves were never meant to be disturbed. The ground had been opened, and something long forgotten had been dragged back into the light. They should have stopped. They didn't. As more soil was cleared, more bones appeared, ribs folded inward, arm bones aligned unnaturally, legs stretched straight as if laid with intention. This was not one grave. This was a burial site. Then another shovel struck again. And again. Another skull. Another body. Another. Soon a row began to take shape. Grave after grave, lined side by side, shallow and unmarked, stretching farther than the workers could immediately see. No headstones. No names. No crosses. Just the dead, laid carefully beneath the soil and left to disappear. The men stood in stunned silence, realizing what they had uncovered wasn't a single tragedy, but many. Questions rose immediately, heavy and unanswered. Who were these people? Why were they buried here? Why were there no markers? And perhaps most unsettling of all, why had no one spoken of this place? Louisiana in 1850 was no stranger to death. Disease swept through towns without mercy. Violence was common, justice uneven. People disappeared, especially those whose lives were considered unimportant by society. Still, something about this discovery felt different. These bodies were not tossed carelessly into a pit. They were arranged, positioned, buried with intent, yet denied remembrance. The workers argued quietly among themselves. Some wanted to leave immediately. Others insisted they should tell someone, an overseer, a landowner, a local authority. But fear hung thick in the air. In a place where speaking too much could cost you work, or worse, silence often felt safer than truth. As the sun climbed higher, the heat returned with vengeance. Sweat dripped from brows onto exposed bone. The smell began to change, not fresh decay, but something older, deeper, disturbed after years of rest. A sour, metallic scent rose from the earth, clinging to clothes and skin. The land had been holding onto these bodies for a long time, and now it had let them go. No one knew exactly how many graves lay hidden beneath that soil. 10? 20? More? Each uncovered body raised new dread. Some skulls bore marks, fractures, dents, signs of violence that told stories no one alive could confirm. Others appeared untouched, as though death had come quietly. Together, They formed a silent testimony, one that the ground had protected until the wrong moment. By midday, word had spread beyond the field. People began to gather at a distance, standing beneath trees, whispering, pointing. No one wanted to step too close. This wasn't just about death anymore. It was about secrets, about history buried on purpose, about truths that had never been meant to surface. Because once the graves were found, there was no putting them back. The workers didn't know it yet, but what they had uncovered would raise questions that no one in that region wanted answered. Questions about ownership, about power, about lives erased so thoroughly that even their resting places were meant to vanish. This was not simply a discovery. It was an accusation. The earth had spoken, and it had chosen that day, in 1850 Louisiana, to reveal what had been hidden in silence for far too long. And as the sun burned overhead, one truth became impossible to ignore. Some graves are unmarked not because they were forgotten, but because someone wanted them that way. By the afternoon, the field no longer felt like a place of labor. It had transformed into something else entirely, an open wound in the earth, exposed and breathing under the Louisiana sun. The workers had stopped digging in neat lines. Now the ground was torn unevenly, patches of soil peeled back like skin, revealing what lay beneath. Each new discovery deepened the silence, replacing shock with something heavier: dread. Someone finally sent for the landowner's overseer. He arrived on horseback, stiff-backed and irritated, clearly annoyed at the interruption. At first, he assumed the men were exaggerating. Workers often told stories to avoid work. But when he dismounted and stepped closer, when he saw the pale curve of bone half buried in the soil, his expression changed. His jaw tightened. His eyes flicked quickly from one exposed grave to another, counting faster than he wanted to admit. This was not an isolated burial. This was deliberate. The overseer ordered the men to stop digging immediately. No more shovels. No more clearing. He told them to step back and wait. His voice was controlled, but his hands betrayed him, clenching and unclenching at his sides. He knew what this meant, or, at least, he knew what it could mean if word spread too far. In 1850 Louisiana, land had memory, whether people wanted to admit it or not. Every plantation, every road, every field carried layers of past violence beneath its surface. Enslaved people vanished. Prisoners disappeared. Travelers were buried without names. And often no one asked questions because questions disrupted order. The overseer sent a rider to town. While they waited, the workers sat beneath the shade of trees, watching the graves from a distance. No one joked now. No one ate. The heat pressed down, but a strange chill lingered. The bodies lay there, half revealed, caught between burial and exposure, as if waiting for someone to acknowledge them. Some of the older workers whispered among themselves. They spoke of stories they'd heard growing up, warnings passed quietly, never written down. Tales of land that swallowed people whole. Of nighttime burials done quickly, without ceremony. Of places no one walked after sundown. One man said his grandmother used to point toward this stretch of land and tell children not to play there. She never explained why. Another remembered rumors of a sickness years earlier, when people died faster than they could be buried properly. But sickness didn't explain the spacing, the alignment, the lack of markers. These graves had intention. When officials finally arrived, local authorities, a doctor and a preacher, the mood shifted again. Formality replaced fear, but tension hung in every movement. The doctor knelt beside the nearest skeleton, brushing dirt away with practiced care. He examined the skull, the teeth, the joints. His face remained neutral, but his silence spoke loudly. "These aren't recent," he finally said. No one asked how old. They already knew the answer would bring more questions. The preacher murmured a prayer under his breath, though it felt less like a blessing and more like an apology. The dead had waited a long time for words like these. The prayer felt late. More graves were counted, far more than anyone expected. A row stretched across the field, then another just beyond it. Some were adults. Some were smaller. Too small. That realization changed the air completely. People stopped whispering. No one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone saw it. Children. The authorities exchanged glances. Decisions were being made silently, behind careful expressions. This discovery could not be undone, but it could be controlled, managed, explained away. By evening, the official story had already begun to form. Unfortunate circumstances. Old burials. No clear records. No evidence of wrongdoing. But the land told a different story. Marks on bones suggested blunt force trauma. Some skulls showed fractures that had healed partially, meaning the individuals had survived injuries before dying later. Others bore damage that could only have happened at the moment of death. Wrists were found close together in a way that felt unnatural. Legs straightened too carefully. Someone had taken time with these bodies. As night approached, lanterns were lit. Shadows stretched across the field, dancing over exposed ribs and hollow eye sockets. The insects returned louder than before, as if reclaiming the space. A decision was announced. The site would be covered again until further instruction. No more digging. No more spectators. The earth would be closed back up. But something had already changed. The workers carried the images with them as they left. The empty skulls, the neat rows, the feeling of being watched by those who could no longer speak. Sleep did not come easily that night. Some swore they smelled the earth on their hands no matter how much they washed. Others dreamed of knocking sounds beneath the ground, rhythmic and insistent. In town, whispers spread despite attempts to contain them. People spoke quietly in doorways and behind closed shutters. Some avoided the road near the field entirely. Others felt drawn to it, compelled by a morbid need to understand what had been hidden. And beneath it all lay the most dangerous question of all. If these people had been buried without names, who had decided their names didn't matter? The graves were closed again within days. Soil was packed tight, smoothed over, disguised. Soon crops would grow there once more. To an untrained eye, nothing would seem out of place. But the land remembered. And so did the people who had seen beneath its surface. Because once the dead are uncovered, they never truly return to silence. In the days that followed, official silence settled over the region like a heavy fog. No notices were posted. No public announcements were made. If anyone expected a formal investigation, they would be disappointed. The graves were reburied, the land smoothed over, and life was meant to move forward as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But silence does not erase memory, it sharpens it. The workers returned to their routines, but none of them were the same. Every shovel of dirt felt heavier. Every patch of ground seemed suspect. Some refused to work near that field again, citing illness or injury rather than admitting fear. Others continued, but with eyes cast downward, as if afraid of what might look back at them from beneath the soil. At night, conversations turned inward and cautious. People spoke in fragments, never finishing sentences. Names were avoided. Instead, there were descriptions, those people, the ones they buried, the forgotten. No one knew who the dead were, yet everyone felt certain they were not strangers. In 1850 Louisiana, records were selective by design. Births, deaths, and ownership were meticulously documented for some. For others, existence itself was barely acknowledged. Enslaved individuals were listed as property, not people. Prisoners vanished between ledger lines. Migrant laborers came and went without trace. And children born into hardship often left no written mark at all. The graves fit that pattern too well. Some townspeople began quietly comparing memories. A missing girl from years back who never returned from an errand. A man who had been arrested and was never seen again. A family that vanished after a dispute with a powerful landholder. Each story alone meant little. Together, they formed something unsettling. Too many disappearances. Too little explanation. An elderly woman claimed she remembered wagons moving at night long ago, traveling without lanterns, wheels wrapped in cloth to muffle sound. She said she was told never to look out the window when she heard them pass. When asked why, she shook her head and said, because some things aren't meant to have witnesses. Others recalled hearing digging in the distance after dark, steady, methodical, never rushed. At the time, it had blended into the background of plantation life. Now, with the graves uncovered, those sounds took on new meaning. The doctor who had examined the bones kept his conclusions private, but word leaked anyway. The ages varied. The causes of death were inconsistent. This was not a single event, not a tragedy born of disease or disaster. This was a pattern. Years of burials. Decades, perhaps. That realization was the most disturbing of all. If the graves had accumulated over time, then many people had known, or at least suspected. Silence had not been accidental. It had been maintained. A few locals pushed for answers, but pressure came swiftly and quietly. Jobs were threatened. Debts were called in. Warnings were delivered politely, with smiles that didn't reach the eyes. Curiosity faded where survival was at stake. History, after all, was written by those who could afford to write it. The field was planted again that season. Rows of crops stretched neatly over the burial ground, their roots pushing downward into soil that held more than nutrients. Some said the plants grew unevenly there, taller in some places, stunted in others. Others claimed nothing grew right at all. Children were told to stay away. And they listened. But even as the surface returned to normal, unease lingered. People avoided speaking names at night. Dogs barked at empty spaces. Travelers reported feeling watched when passing through the area, as if the land itself had eyes. The dead had been returned to the earth, but they had not been laid to rest. Because rest requires recognition. No markers were ever placed. No memorial raised. No attempt made to identify the bodies. Their anonymity remained intact, preserved as carefully as their burial had been. It was as if someone feared that naming them, truly acknowledging who they were, might unravel something far larger. And perhaps it would have. Because if those graves belonged to people who had been silenced in life, then uncovering their stories threatened the foundation of the world above them. It questioned who held power, who decided whose lives mattered, who could erase another human being and expect the earth to comply. But the earth never truly forgets. Long after the workers who found the graves were gone, long after the overseer and officials passed away, the story lingered. It survived not in documents, but in warnings, glances, and the instinctive knowledge that some places are heavy for a reason. The dead beneath that field remained unnamed, but they were not unknown. They were the missing, the uncounted, the people history chose not to see. And though their bones were hidden once more, their presence pressed upward through the soil, through memory, through time, waiting for the day someone would listen again. Because secrets buried in rows don't disappear. They wait. As weeks turned into months, the discovery faded from public conversation, but not from thought. Silence had been enforced, not earned. People learned which questions not to ask and which roads not to walk after dusk. Yet beneath that surface calm, something restless moved through the community, an unease that refused to settle. Those who had seen the graves could not forget their order. They had not been random. They had not been hurried. Each body had been laid with care, aligned in rows that suggested planning, repetition, and familiarity. Someone had returned to that place again and again, under cover of darkness or authority, knowing exactly where to dig each time. That was the detail that haunted people most. Because chaos leaves messes. But this had been organized. A schoolteacher in town quietly began making notes, dates when people were last seen, rumors of disputes, unexplained absences. She never shared her list publicly. She didn't need to. The act of writing it down was dangerous enough. Still, the pattern became harder to ignore. Disappearances spiked during certain years. Periods of unrest. Times when discipline was enforced harshly, when authority felt threatened. The graves seemed to mirror those moments. Some bodies bore signs of restraint. Others showed healed injuries, suggesting long-term suffering before death. This wasn't only punishment, it was control. A system that removed people not just physically, but historically. And systems require permission. Whether spoken or implied, many had allowed it to continue. By looking away. By accepting explanations that didn't make sense. By convincing themselves it wasn't their concern. Fear had done the rest. One former constable, long retired and embittered by age, let something slip during a late-night conversation. He spoke of special burials, of orders that came without paperwork, of men told not to ask questions if they wanted to keep their positions. He never named names. He didn't have to. The implication alone was enough to chill the room. The land had been chosen carefully, far enough from town, yet close enough to reach quickly, familiar enough to feel safe, controlled enough to remain quiet. A burial ground hidden in plain sight. And then there were the children. That detail resurfaced again and again, whispered with horror. Smaller bones. Shorter graves. The idea that innocence had been buried alongside adults forced people to confront a truth far more disturbing than violence alone. This wasn't just about punishment or secrecy. It was about erasure across generations. If no one remembered them, they would never be missed. Families that once existed had vanished completely, leaving no one to ask where their children had gone. No one to mark anniversaries. No one to demand answers. The graves ensured that silence stayed permanent. But the land itself resisted. Years after the discovery, farmers continued to report strange irregularities in that field. Tools would snag unexpectedly. Soil collapsed without warning. Crops failed in neat, unnatural lines. Rain pooled where it shouldn't have, as if the earth still remembered the shape of what lay beneath. Some refused to farm it altogether. Others claimed they heard sounds at night, soft, rhythmic disturbances beneath the ground, digging, shifting, as if the buried were turning restlessly, unsettled by their return to anonymity. Superstition grew where facts had been denied. People spoke of curses, of restless spirits, of land that rejected the living. But superstition was safer than truth. Ghost stories required no accountability. History did. And history was exactly what had been buried. The most unsettling realization came slowly, reluctantly, as the years passed. If these graves had gone undiscovered for so long, then how many others existed elsewhere? How many fields, forests, and forgotten corners of Louisiana concealed similar rows, smoothed over and planted again? The discovery had not exposed an exception. It had exposed a method. That understanding frightened people far more than the bones ever had, because it meant the graves weren't the result of chaos or madness. They were the result of structure, of power exercised quietly and efficiently, of people who knew they would never be challenged. And they weren't wrong. No official investigation was ever reopened. No memorial erected. No public reckoning followed. The graves returned to silence, and with time, so did the outrage. New generations grew up hearing only fragments, warnings without explanations. But the truth lingered, suspended between memory and myth. Some said the land should never have been disturbed. Others believed it was the land itself that had finally spoken, tired of holding secrets it never agreed to keep. Either way, the discovery had cracked something open. Because once people realize that history can be buried deliberately, they begin to question everything they've been told. They start to wonder whose stories are missing and why. The graves had no names, but they had meaning. They stood as proof that silence is not the same as peace, and forgetting is often enforced, not accidental. The earth had kept its secret for as long as it could. Then, for one brief moment in 1850, it let the truth rise to the surface. And even though it was buried again, that truth never fully went back underground. By the time the next decade arrived, the graves had faded into something half-remembered, spoken of only in careful tones, as if even acknowledging them invited trouble. What had once shocked the community now lived in the shadows of conversation, mentioned only when trust ran deep or when grief loosened tongues. Silence was no longer just fear. It had become routine. And routine, in many ways, is the most effective form of control. The land continued to be worked, sold, and inherited. New owners came who never knew what lay beneath their fields. Old ones passed away without leaving written testimony. The workers who had first uncovered the graves scattered. Some moved away, others died, taking their memories with them. The story thinned as time passed, its edges blurred, details softened, until it became easier to dismiss. That, perhaps, was the point all along. In the absence of records, silence filled the gaps. No legal documents tied anyone to the burials. No eyewitness statements were preserved. No official acknowledgement ever existed. Without proof, there could be no accusation. And without accusation, there could be no responsibility. What remained was a ghost story masquerading as history. Yet fragments persisted. A faded diary entry that mentioned digging after moonrise. A ledger with names crossed out rather than recorded as deceased. A preacher's sermon that spoke cryptically of souls denied rest by human hands. Each piece alone meant little. Together, they hinted at a truth that had been deliberately fractured. Those in power understood something fundamental. Time was on their side. Years passed, and the moral weight of the discovery dulled. People grew accustomed to living atop old injustices. It became easier to accept that the past was simply darker, more brutal, and beyond correction. That mindset protected the present from scrutiny. But beneath the soil, nothing had changed. The bodies remained where they had been laid, compressed by years of earth, their stories unfinished. Bones shifted slowly as roots grew around them. Coffinless and unnamed, they existed in a liminal state, neither fully erased nor fully acknowledged. Some locals believed the dead were waiting for recognition, waiting for someone to say they mattered, waiting for history to catch up. Stories began circulating of those who tried to alter the land, dig deeper, build foundations, install fences, only to encounter repeated accidents. Tools broke inexplicably. Workers fell ill. Projects stalled. The land resisted change, as if refusing to be repurposed without reckoning. Whether coincidence or conscience, people took notice. Children, too, seemed affected. They avoided the field instinctively, without being told. They complained of strange dreams, of standing in rows, of being called by names they didn't recognize, of hands reaching up from the ground. Parents dismissed it as imagination. But some wondered if memory could exist beyond the living. Because history doesn't vanish. It waits. The discovery in 1850 had been brief, but its implications were enormous. It revealed not just a hidden burial ground, but a system that thrived on invisibility. A world where certain lives could be removed without consequence, provided no one documented their absence. And perhaps most disturbingly, it showed how easily communities could be conditioned to accept that erasure. Silence became policy not through force alone, but through convenience, through fear, through the understanding that speaking up rarely benefits those with the least to lose. By the time the Civil War loomed on the horizon, the graves had become a footnote, if that. New violence, new upheaval, new deaths eclipsed the old ones. The ground absorbed it all, layer upon layer, until history itself felt stratified like sediment. But even as the world changed above, the past remained intact below. The unmarked graves were not an anomaly. They were a mirror, reflecting the values of a society that measured worth selectively. They were the physical manifestation of decisions made quietly and justified afterward. And they served as a warning. Because when a society chooses silence over truth, it builds its future on unstable ground. The earth may hold for a time, but eventually, pressure finds a way out. The workers in 1850 had learned that firsthand. They had touched the past with their bare hands and felt its weight. They had seen what happens when stories are buried instead of told. And even if they never spoke of it again, the knowledge stayed with them, etched deeper than memory. Some secrets are buried to be forgotten. Others are buried to be discovered. And when the earth finally opens, it does so on its own terms. Time moved forward, but the land did not forget. Long after the original witnesses were gone, long after the story had faded into rumor, the burial ground continued to assert its presence in quiet, unsettling ways. People who had never heard the full story still felt it. The weight, the wrongness. the sense that something beneath their feet refused to stay buried. New families settled nearby, unaware of what the soil held. They planted gardens, built homes, raised children. And at first, nothing seemed unusual. But slowly, patterns emerged, subtle enough to dismiss individually, impossible to ignore together. Animals avoided the area instinctively. Horses refused to cross certain patches of land. Dogs barked at nothing, hackles raised, eyes fixed on empty ground. Birds avoided nesting nearby, choosing trees farther away for reasons no one could explain. The land behaved as though it were occupied. Those who worked the soil reported persistent disturbances. Trenches collapsed overnight. Freshly turned earth appeared disturbed by mourning. Stakes driven into the ground came loose without reason. Each incident was minor. Together, they formed a message unspoken, yet insistent. Something was still there. Dreams, too, became part of the folklore. Repeated themes appeared across generations. People dreamed of standing in long lines, shoulder to shoulder, unable to move. Others dreamed of watching from above as bodies were lowered into the ground without ceremony. Many described the same sensation, a desperate need to be remembered, pressing against the edges of consciousness. Skeptics dismissed it as inherited superstition. But even they avoided the field at night. Because deep down, everyone understood one thing: the dead had never been given permission to rest. Without names, without acknowledgement, without justice, they lingered in memory like an unfinished sentence. History had paused mid-thought and never returned to complete it. Occasionally, attempts were made to repurpose the land more aggressively. A developer once proposed building over it, confident that progress would erase whatever discomfort remained. Construction began with optimism and ended in abandonment. Equipment failed repeatedly. Foundations cracked. Workers quit without explanation, citing unease rather than injury. The project was quietly canceled. No official reason was given. Locals didn't need one. The graves exerted influence not through force, but through persistence. They reminded the living that erasure has limits. That time can dull outrage, but not eliminate truth. That beneath every polished surface lies a history waiting to be acknowledged. Some residents began to argue that the dead deserved recognition. A marker, a memorial, anything that admitted they had existed. But opposition surfaced immediately. Old families resisted reopening the past. Officials claimed there was no documentation, no certainty, no reason to stir unrest. The familiar arguments returned. It was too long ago. No one alive was responsible. Digging it up would only cause harm. But harm had already been done. And it continued, quietly. Every day the graves remained unnamed. The dead were not ghosts in the traditional sense. They did not rattle chains or appear in the night. Their presence was heavier than that, more insidious. They existed as absence, as missing names, as questions without answers. They haunted records more than roads. Historians would later note how entire families vanished from documents during certain years, how labor counts fluctuated without explanation, how burial records skipped numbers. These gaps were not mistakes. They were intentional omissions. The graves explained those omissions. They were the physical proof of what paperwork had erased. The land had become an archive, one written in bone instead of ink. Each body a record, each grave a paragraph. Together, they told a story no ledger could safely contain. And though no formal acknowledgement ever came, the truth endured in other ways. In discomfort, in avoidance, in the knowledge that something unresolved lay beneath everyday life. The dead never left because they were never dismissed. To dismiss something, you must first face it. The workers in 1850 had glimpsed that truth briefly, before it was buried again. They had seen what happens when history surfaces uninvited. They had felt the weight of lives erased not by chance, but by design. And that weight remained. The graves became a quiet boundary, a place people stepped around rather than crossed. A reminder that land can absorb violence, but it does not forgive it. Eventually, even the story of the graves would fade further, reduced to a whisper, then a shadow. But the earth would continue to hold its memory, patient and unyielding, waiting, because some truths don't need witnesses. They wait for the right moment to rise again. Decades passed, yet the story of the unmarked graves in Louisiana never fully disappeared. In quiet conversations, in cautious glances, and in the persistent sense of unease that seemed to hang over the land, people remembered. Not by choice, but because the memory refused to be silenced. The field had become more than soil. It was a presence, a warning, a repository for lives that had been erased on paper, but not in reality. Local legends began to grow around the site. Stories circulated of workers seeing shadows move just beyond the tree line at dusk, of feeling cold gusts of wind in the middle of summer, of hearing faint tapping or scratching coming from beneath freshly tilled soil. The stories were dismissed by newcomers and outsiders, but those who lived nearby knew better. They had seen it, felt it, carried it. There was a weight to the land that could not be explained, a weight that pressed down even when no one was digging, planting, or walking upon it. Some claimed the dead tried to speak, not in words, but through patterns. Crops grew unevenly in straight lines over the graves, or soil seemed softer or darker, where bodies lay close together. Livestock refused to step into certain patches. Animals sensed the presence in a way humans could not, and those who observed quietly came to understand that these signs were warnings, unmistakable and silent. They were reminders that the land itself remembered the lives it had been forced to contain. Historians and local scholars who later tried to piece together records discovered anomalies. Names vanished abruptly from census lists. Ledger books contained gaps that corresponded to periods of unrest or disease, and burial records were suspiciously incomplete. The gaps were too large, too systematic, to be accidental. The unmarked graves of 1850 had not been the exception. They had been part of a hidden system of control, a pattern that extended beyond the fields, beyond the plantation, and into the heart of the county. Even without names, the dead communicated in ways the living could perceive. Workers reported strange dreams, standing in rows, unable to move, watching as figures were laid in shallow graves, or seeing their small hands pressed against cold earth, trying to rise. Children occasionally spoke of seeing shapes in the field at twilight, figures too pale, too still to be alive. These stories were hushed and shared only in whispers, often dismissed as imagination. But when multiple accounts mirrored each other, a sense of inevitability took hold. Something had happened here, and it had left its mark. The moral implications were immense. If the dead had been buried intentionally, methodically, and without recognition, then history had been deliberately edited. Decisions about who mattered, who could vanish, and who was forgotten had been inscribed not on paper, but in the soil. The unmarked graves were a testament to a society that valued some lives over others and erased entire existences with impunity. And yet, the earth refused to forget. By remaining intact, the burials became evidence, silent but undeniable, of injustice that would never fully vanish. Some residents argued for action. Markers should be placed, records examined, stories told. Others resisted, fearful of opening old wounds or of implicating powerful families whose influence had persisted over generations. The tension between acknowledgement and denial persisted, a quiet tug-of-war between conscience and convenience. For every person willing to confront the past, there was another insisting the past should remain buried. The land itself became a judge, jury, and witness in a trial the living dared not pursue. The discovery in 1850, once shocking, became a lesson. It was a reminder that history is never truly gone, that erasure is temporary when witnesses exist, and that silence cannot erase truth. Every unmarked grave, every absent name, and every forgotten child was a story waiting for recognition. Even decades later, the whispers of those lives carried forward, shaping the behavior of the living, influencing decisions and haunting dreams. And yet, despite the unease, life continued. Farmers tilled the soil. Children played nearby, often warned but still curious. Travelers passed through without knowing what lay beneath their feet. The field became ordinary on the surface, but it retained an extraordinary depth below. Each layer of earth covered not just bones, but history, memory, and morality. Each burial, carefully arranged and hidden, continued to speak through absence, echoing the lives of those who had been denied acknowledgement. The dead were patient. They had been forced into silence, hidden beneath layers of earth and secrecy, yet they endured. And while the living attempted to continue as if nothing had happened, the memory of their unmarked graves persisted, a quiet insistence that some truths cannot be buried. Every crop that grew unevenly, every animal that hesitated, every whispered story became part of a larger pattern, a map of a past deliberately obscured but never erased. The field had become a paradox, ordinary and terrifying at once. Its surface promised nothing, yet its soil held everything. The unmarked graves were invisible to most, yet undeniable to those who knew where and how to look. They were reminders that even in the absence of names, even in the absence of acknowledgement, lives had existed, had mattered, and had left a mark that could not be ignored. Time had not healed this wound, it had only deepened it. And so the land waited. Silent, patient, unyielding. The dead waited as well, not as restless spirits in the way the living imagine, but as witnesses, observers, and guardians of memory. They waited for acknowledgement, for reckoning, for history to finally confront them and give voice to what had been silenced. Every rustle of leaves, every uneven row of crops, every shadow at dusk was a reminder. The dead do not vanish simply because the living choose not to see them. Over a century had passed since the workers first unearthed the row of unmarked graves in Louisiana, yet the field remained a place apart from the ordinary world. To the casual observer, it was nothing more than farmland, rows of crops stretching neatly, soil tilled for planting, sunlight glinting off the leaves. But beneath the surface, the truth remained, etched in bone and memory, a history no ledger, no law, and no authority could erase. The land had a voice, quiet but insistent, and it spoke through subtle disturbances that no one could entirely ignore. Soil would collapse in patches where nothing had been dug, crops grew unevenly in strange patterns, and animals avoided certain areas instinctively. Travelers and locals alike felt the weight of something hidden, something ancient. Even those who had never seen the graves could sense that the earth held secrets, that beneath their feet lay stories long denied acknowledgement. Generations of children grew up hearing fragments, cautious whispers of shadows at dusk, of hands reaching up from the ground, of places not to play. For them, it was both a warning and a fascination. Some dismissed it as folklore, a cautionary tale passed down to instill obedience or respect. But others carried the unease forward, a subtle understanding that life and death were intertwined in ways the living could not always comprehend. Historians who later investigated the region stumbled upon gaps in records that made little sense. Families who had vanished were absent from census rolls. Labor counts fluctuated without explanation. Burial logs were incomplete or missing entirely. Each anomaly hinted at a pattern, an unbroken system of erasure, just as the unmarked graves had suggested. It was a history deliberately hidden, a reality denied in plain sight. Yet the land itself refused to lie. Its memory persisted. And still, the dead waited. Not as spirits in the way people imagined, floating or haunting, but as witnesses. Their lives, erased from documentation and remembrance, were recorded in another medium, the earth. Bones aligned with care, graves carefully laid in rows, bodies positioned with intention. Even without names, the presence of these lives could not be denied. They existed in absence, in omission, in silence made deliberate. Their stories were incomplete, but the land preserved them with stubborn fidelity. Visitors who stumbled upon the site, or those drawn by curiosity, reported sensations they could not explain. Uneasy feelings of being watched, sudden chills in the midday sun, the inexplicable stalling of tools, animals behaving erratically. These experiences were often dismissed by outsiders as coincidence or imagination, but those who had grown up near the field understood differently. The earth had memory. The dead had memory, and they were patient. The moral weight of the graves persisted across time. They were a reminder of decisions made by the living, choices about who could be forgotten, who could be erased, who was considered unimportant. They were evidence that erasure can never be complete, that history will find ways to surface even when those in power wish it to remain hidden. Silence may be enforced, but memory endures. The unmarked graves of 1850 Louisiana were a paradox. Ordinary on the surface, extraordinary beneath. A field that seemed mundane concealed a story of lives erased, of generations silenced, of injustice buried under soil. And yet, because it existed, because the earth refused to forget, it demanded recognition, even if the living were unwilling to provide it. In the end, the story is simple and terrifying at once. Some truths do not vanish, no matter how carefully they are concealed. Names may be lost. Records may be incomplete. Memories may fade. But bones do not lie. Soil remembers. The earth holds the story when humans will not. And the dead, even when unmarked and forgotten, continue to exert their presence, silently insisting that they existed, that they mattered, that history cannot ignore them forever. So the field waits. The graves remain, concealed beneath generations of tilled soil, crops, and sunlight. But the weight is palpable. The pattern cannot be erased. The story endures, not on paper, not in monuments, but in the quiet persistence of the land itself. Every blade of grass, every root, every subtle disturbance carries the message. The earth remembers. The dead do not forget. And one day, those who have been silenced may finally speak again, not with words, but with the undeniable truth written into the ground beneath our feet. Because some graves are more than places to bury the dead. They are witnesses. They are history. They are warnings. And for those willing to see, to listen, and to understand, the land speaks with a voice older and more patient than any living human could ever command.